History has been a rocky road for those we label as mad.
The mentally ill were treated more like animals than human beings.
There was no hope of cure, only endless torture.
They could bleed them, they could leech them, they could douse them with cold fluids.
Out of sight, out of mind was no answer either, as their voices struggled to be heard.
This treatment causes violent muscular reactions throughout the entire body.
But a new age has dawned. Has drug therapy finally cured the problems of the fragile mind? The village of Geel in Belgium looks at first glance like many others across Europe. But it is unique. It is an unusual town, inhabited by unusual people. Fernanda is one of them. Like many of the townsfolk of Geel, Fernanda is mentally ill. Yet she is free to enjoy life in a way few other people with her condition have experienced at any time in history. For over 600 years, the people of Geel have honored a special pact to look after their less fortunate neighbors. Their unique system, called family care, is symbolized by the statue in the town square. But if Fernanda had lived in earlier times, her life and the town square would have been very different. For most of history, there was no such thing as mental illness. There was simply madness. Its sufferers were feared and persecuted, and their so-called treatment indistinguishable from torture and murder.
Throughout history, there's been a great fear of people suffering from mental illness. Of course, for many centuries, there was a belief that those who acted in strange ways were possessed by evil spirits or by the devil, and consequently they were to be feared. I think even today there's a degree of fear in the general public of people who have been diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder, who have displayed unusual behaviors, because we don't understand mental illness.
We may not understand it, but we do know where it springs from. The human brain is the most complex object yet discovered in the universe. It contains billions of cells or neurons interlinked in impossibly complex ways. Like any other organ of the body, the brain is affected by disease. It can malfunction. But a sick brain can change how we think and behave towards others. The very things that make us human. With no knowledge of the brain, our ancestors blamed external, supernatural forces for madness. Dark forces which entered the mind and drove the unfortunate victim insane. The most ancient way of getting them out was also mankind's first surgical procedure. Trepanning was performed by many cultures who believed that all a polluted mind really needed was a little fresh air. Screaming devils inside the head were released by simply boring a hole in it. The ancient Romans blamed the heavens for their mental troubles. The word lunatic comes from luna, the Latin word for moon. The Romans knew a lot about lunatics because there was usually one in charge. Of all the mad Roman emperors, and there were plenty, Caligula stood out. He started off fairly mildly by making his horse a senator, but it was all downhill from there. During his reign, he showed a flair for madness, cruelty, and megalomania seldom matched in history. It's now suspected schizophrenia was responsible for much of his extreme behavior, and only his godlike status protected him from the usual fate of the mentally ill. Someone with a better claim to godlike status cured the mad instead of joining them. Jesus drove out the devils of insanity by a simple laying on of hands. Unfortunately, his followers in later centuries were rarely so gentle. Their philosophy was to fight fire with fire. The devils of madness were whipped, stomped, or burnt out. All for the patient's own good, of course. Religious fervor reached its peak between 1500 and 1700, when thousands of mad people were burnt as witches and deviants. By the 16th century, the spilling of blood was a little more methodical. By then it was believed that all disease was carried in the body's vital fluids. Medicinal bleeding was a popular treatment. Popular with doctors, anyway. Physicians either tapped the veins themselves or enlisted the help of friendly leeches. If leeches weren't available, or didn't like the look of a prospective meal, a kind of artificial leech was applied to suck blood out, a practice known as cupping. Although over 2,500 years old, cupping is still practiced in the health spas of Finland. Other methods of purging were even stranger.
O'Halloran swing was designed in Europe by an Irishman. It was brought to the United States. Basically what we do is strap somebody into the chair and spin them around. This dates back to the days when they thought that most illness, including mental illness, was blood or fluid borne. And so by spinning the person using centrifugal force, you would get the impure blood away from the brain and out into the arms and the fingers. If they threw up while you were doing this, that was a form of purging the bad fluids out of them too.
But the epitome of the art was the tranquilizing chair, which managed to combine all the other fiendish methods into a kind of one-stop shop for torturing the mentally ill.
A patient would be strapped into it for as much as 6 months. They could bleed them, they could leech them, they could douse them with cold fluids, put their feet into ice packs and pour hot fluids over their head. Just a variety of things, all with the idea of bringing them back to reality.
Faced with this kind of abuse everywhere else, it was no wonder a sanctuary for the mentally ill proved popular. For over 600 years, Geel has been a holy place for the mad, and home to their patron saint, Dympna. The story of how this came to be is a tale of incest, murder, and miracles. In the year 600, the Queen of Ireland lay mortally ill. Crippled with grief, the king decided his daughter, Dympna, could be her only replacement. Dympna refused her father's incestuous attentions and fled to Belgium. With the devils of madness increasingly whispering in his ear, the king searched until he found her in Geel. After being refused again, and with the devil guiding his hand, the enraged and insane king beheaded his daughter. Because she died resisting the dark forces of her father's insanity, Dympna became the patron saint of madness, and is usually portrayed stamping on its squirming devils. Her church in Geel became a holy site, and soon reports of miraculous healings began. As word spread, more and more patients came to have their own devils driven out. At first they stayed in the cathedral, but as their numbers grew, the priests asked the townspeople to help out.
And so it began to grow until all the families here in the surroundings of the St. Dympna Church began to take mentally ill patients in their own houses and took care of them.
They were free to live as ordinary citizens. But for sufferers elsewhere, freedom was a far-off dream, as torture was replaced with imprisonment. Saint Dympna, the patron saint of madness, keeps a watchful eye over the central hospital in Geel. The hospital has an open-door policy, meaning that Fernanda and the other patients can come and go as they please. As well as medical help, the hospital also supplies activities to keep them busy and allow them to express themselves, an important part of their therapy. Patients can give something back to the community by doing simple jobs. The bicycle repair shop keeps half of Geel on the move. But the mentally ill once had to endure a much worse kind of chain, as this sculpture by a former patient shows. From the 17th century onward, belief in satanic possession all but disappeared in most countries. Instead of suffering torture, the mad were kept locked away from the rest of society. The name of their prison became one of the most infamous and abused words in the English language.
The most terrifying form of evil is that which lurks within the human mind. Asylum, the ultimate in horror.
This is an asylum for the incurably insane.
Asylum, you have nothing to lose but your mind.
The Imperial War Museum in London was once the most notorious of asylums, one which made its own contribution to the English language. Bedlam is a word that is now inseparable from chaos and mayhem. While the guns from mighty battleships now stand guard outside, the entrance was once under the gaze of two statues, raving and melancholy madness. These tortured figures provide mute testimony to the grim conditions that once existed inside. These are documented in a 1735 painting by William Hogarth called The Rake's Progress. It shows scenes that are literally bedlam. Filthy and deranged patients roaming free and unsupervised in the chaos of the wards, where they would probably spend their whole lives. The painting betrays another of Bedlam's guilty secrets: two spectators watching for sheer entertainment. Where families now visit the War Museum for recreation, 200 years ago, their ancestors walked the same halls for the same reason. Asylums and their unfortunate residents were a popular form of amusement for 18th century Europeans. French asylums were equally bad. In 1790, the physician Philippe Pinel was placed in charge of the Bicêtre, the hospital for the mentally ill in Paris. He was appalled at what he saw.
I've told you I can't remember. I can't remember. I've told you I can't remember. I can't remember.
To the horror of his colleagues, Pinel ordered the release of the patients from their chains, and in place of dungeons, they were provided with sunny rooms and access to the hospital grounds. This was a major turning point in the treatment of the mentally ill, as Pinel's philosophy of treating them with kindness instead of cruelty sparked a wave of psychiatric reform. An investigation of Bedlam in 1813 revealed, among other horrors, the fate of James William Norris. He had been kept in Bedlam's basement for somewhere between 9 and 14 years in a specially constructed iron restraint which encased his body from the neck down. Norris's treatment triggered further outrage at the conditions of asylums, and across Europe they were swiftly converted to comfortable hospitals for recovery rather than prisons. This change in thinking reached America as well, largely due to the efforts of one woman.
Dorothea Dix was probably one of the leading reformers of her time. She concentrated on reforming the facilities in Massachusetts and Connecticut to the point that she finally got them cleaned out and got the cells cleaned out. People weren't chained to the walls.
From the 1800s on, a new breed of mental hospital was built, and the term asylum mostly abandoned. These huge monoliths were self-sufficient cities in their own right, owning their own farms, bakeries, and even power plants. But their residents still had little hope of cure, and although the chains were gone, many patients simply swapped one set of restraints for another.
In the 19th century, when psychiatry was born, people believed that mental illness had an underlying biological basis in the brain. And in fact, they were quite right about that. But science in those days was so underdeveloped, there wasn't any such thing as neuroscience, that they couldn't really establish what was the scientific brain basis for mental symptoms.
And so focus returned to mysterious cosmic forces thought to influence human behavior. One such force was called animal magnetism by its discoverer, Franz Mesmer. He believed the mental state of patients could be controlled by channeling this energy through them. This was achieved by putting the patient into a trance, a method named mesmerism after its discoverer. Mesmer's theories of animal magnetism never caught on, but his trance therapy was adapted by psychiatrists and renamed hypnotism to make it more credible. Physicians such as Jean Charcot began to experiment with revealing the inner thoughts of patients under hypnosis. But it was one of his students who would really revolutionize psychiatry, when he realized that patients needn't be put into a trance to recall their deepest problems. All they really needed was a comfortable couch. The student's name was Sigmund Freud.
Psychoanalysis came along at the end of the 19th century and had a totally different vision of the causes of mental illness. It was thought to have nothing to do with the brain. It was believed and said to be psychogenic, to arise in the mind. And Freud's own version of it was that psychiatric illness arose as a result of anomalies in early childhood socialization, problems with toilet training, having seen the mother naked, having heard mommy and daddy making love one night. That could ruin you forever, basically, in terms of psychiatric illness.
But not everyone is so cynical about Freud's theories.
The idea of psychoanalysis is that there is a part of the mind that is the unconscious, that is not actually accessible to rational, everyday thought. And the unconscious is a very unruly part of the mind. It contains all sorts of repressed wishes, memories from childhood that may affect current behavior.
And the way to unlock these secrets is to ask the right questions and think very carefully about the replies.
You must say everything that comes into your head, even if it's unpleasant for you, or seems unimportant, or irrelevant, or even senseless. I've always been tormented by criminal impulses.
What is extraordinary is many people have very strong opinions about Freud who will never have read a word of his work. And then often when people get back to his work and read it, they realize that and given that there are 23 volumes in English, there's an extraordinary amount of observation, analysis, speculation that can be plumbed in the 21st century.
You unconsciously suppressed the fact that you owed the money to the girl at the post office because it recalled conflicts that were too painful for you to remember.
But while psychoanalysis was handy for the rich and neurotic, it could do nothing for the seriously ill residents of the crowded hospitals. Instead, they were in for a shock. Despite her mental illness, Fernanda can live a normal home life with her foster mother, Linda. She has at last found somewhere she belongs. And after losing her husband, Linda has someone to keep her company.
I am very happy Fernanda is living here because she's very helpful. I am very grateful for her and I respect her. I try to say each day, Fernanda, I am happy you are here. You are very important to me. And it is little things like this that make her feel better about herself. She feels part of a family.
Fernanda is also helped by having responsibilities, like washing up. Indeed, water has long been used to help patients. The early 20th century saw a return to the elements in treating the mentally ill. Hydrotherapy involved putting agitated patients in a bath of warm water until they calmed down. A fairly effective cure, as all of us who love a hot bath know well. However, this represented the most sophisticated end of the spectrum. For many years, patients got plenty of hydro, but very little therapy. Most hydrotherapy was designed to shock rather than soothe, the equivalent of a slap around the face to snap patients out of their madness. The moral and spiritual sins of insanity were washed away by the much more wholesome practice of dressing up in sailor hats and squirting each other with hoses. But doctors soon found a problem that no amount of water could fix, no matter how high pressure. The return of one of history's deadliest diseases, syphilis.
Syphilis was a major cause of dementia. Probably 80% of all cases in mental hospitals were either caused by alcohol or by syphilis. Syphilis was the AIDS of the time.
After incubating for as long as 10 years, syphilis germs eventually attacked the brain and began to literally eat it. Not surprisingly, neurosyphilis caused severe physical and mental disturbance, as did the cheap science fiction movies it inspired.
Ejected from unexplored secret stratus, this giant, harder than steel piston disgorges strange creatures, inundating our world, twisting the emotions of women, distorting our men. See, the brain eaters.
Although not easily burnt off with Bunsen burners, the real brain eaters did prove vulnerable to heat. Dr. Julius Wagner von Jauregg, a Viennese neurologist, found a radical cure for neurosyphilis in 1917, ironically by pitting one of humanity's greatest enemies against another. Malaria is responsible for more deaths than any other disease, but von Jauregg found it could cure as well as kill. He found that injecting neurosyphilis patients with a mild strain of malaria caused a fever which killed the syphilis germs. The effects were dramatic. Patients who had been crippled with delusions, tremors, and loss of motor skills were almost completely cured within weeks. For the first time in history, a specific treatment had been found for a specific mental illness.
So it was the first glimpse by neuroscience that physical methods acting as a whole upon the brain could cure or could improve the condition of patients.
Encouraged by this success, doctors began to look for physical cures for other mental illnesses. The first targeted was schizophrenia. Physicians had long noticed that patients who suffered epileptic convulsions were very rarely schizophrenic. Based on this observation, psychiatrists leapt to a rather large conclusion.
So the thought was that if the convulsions could be artificially induced, perhaps this would cure the schizophrenia.
The first method attempted was injecting patients with insulin. Insulin is a hormone responsible for maintaining glucose levels in the blood, and an overdose of it caused a shortage of glucose to the brain cells. Convulsions and a deep coma soon followed. But it also seemed to shock some patients into recovery.
It did not do much to cure the schizophrenia, but they found through experience that those patients who had been suffering from depression suddenly were on top of the world. They were feeling better. And so therefore it became a form of treatment for severe depression.
Another drug called Metrazole was cheaper, faster, and more powerful than insulin in provoking convulsions. Too powerful, as it turned out, as nearly half of patients injected with it suffered spinal fractures. And both drugs proved hard to control.
So they would give insulin, and then to stop the convulsions, they would give a glucose injection. If you don't do this well, you may kill the patient, right? Metrazole is even more dangerous. So physicians needed a cleaner way of provoking convulsions, more controllable way.
After already using fire and water to treat the mentally ill, physicians turned to another primal force, electricity. Ancient Roman physicians had first harnessed its power by placing electric rays on the heads of the mad. They called the numbness caused by their shocks narcos, or sleep, which is where we get the term narcotics. In the 18th and 19th centuries, scientists tried to control electricity and magnetism by artificial means, often with alarming results. Mild shocks were applied to muscles and nerves. But they still didn't put a smile on the face of patients. In 1937, 2 Italian doctors were inspired by watching animals being stunned at the local slaughterhouse. Ironic, considering what was to follow. They developed a method of applying strong shocks across the skulls of humans, a process that would become infamously known as electroconvulsive therapy.
This was by far the best method of provoking shock therapy, and was widely used, and insulin and metrazole were abandoned.
ECT was adopted around the globe and swiftly became standard treatment for many severe illnesses, especially severe depression. Although results varied, it enjoyed some spectacular successes. Many patients who were paralyzed with grief and despair regained their will to live.
Shock treatment is the most widely used and the most successful method of curing mental illness. This treatment causes violent muscular reactions throughout the entire body and must be supervised by a trained doctor. No one is quite sure how or why shock treatment cures mental illness, but it does straighten out tangled thinking, and the greatest majority of patients so treated are cured.
Unfortunately, ECT's success would also prove to be its downfall, as it became overused and then inevitably abused.
When I was assisting with electroconvulsive therapy, the average length of treatment might be 5 to 10 experiences, and there were patients there that had 300, 400, 500 treatments without stopping. And as a result, their senses were dulled, their brains were just fried, from the extensive use of ECT.
It was even used as a means of punishment.
If a patient left the hospital on unauthorized absence or misbehaved in some way and displeased the physicians, they could be transferred to electroconvulsive therapy. Although there was no pain associated with the treatment, it was really something terrible for the patients to anticipate, and there was a lot of fear associated with it.
But this fear was nothing compared to the outright terror another radical treatment would bring: the ice pick lobotomy. As the people of Geel go about their daily lives, it's impossible to tell who among them is mentally ill and who isn't. And to them, it doesn't matter. Unfortunately, most people have always judged by appearances.
The more invisible something is, such as mental illness, the more we have to make it visible. So in the Middle Ages, there is a very strong set of images that have to do with the way the mentally ill look. In the 19th century, starting really in about the 1860s, what had been theological notions of madness, God punishing become scientific notions of madness. And a French physician by the name of Morel takes the notion of the fall from grace, right, the being driven out of the Garden of Eden, and he turns it into a medical notion called degeneration. The madman is degenerate, and he bears upon his or her face the signs of their degeneracy. They're throwbacks to earlier stages of human development. They look primitive. And that's the beginning of a kind of a science of insanity, a science of being able to see the insane. By the end of the 19th century, there are atlases, literally atlases, like atlases of maps. We have atlases of pictures of the mad, which enable us to take and look at that picture and look at the patient and say, ah, that person has depression, that person has melancholia, because that person looks like a depressive.
When photography became available to asylums at the end of the 19th century, it too was used as a method of diagnosis. Patients were forced to have their portraits taken as part of their so-called treatment. But sight wasn't the only sense used to diagnose the mentally ill. An even stranger method involved touch.
Phrenology is a pseudoscientific idea that you can tell a person's personality by the bumps on your head. It was invented by Franz Joseph Gall, a Viennese physician, in 1798. It was a sensation. The church banned it, which added to its popularity. The great advantage of it was that people used to think crazy people had the devil in them, and they would beat the devil out of crazy people. Dr. Gall said, no, it's because their head is misshapen.
Due largely to a lack of competition, Gall's theories became wildly popular, and he lectured to huge crowds across Europe. Phrenology soon spread to America and claimed some famous successes.
Thomas Edison was in a grocery store until a phrenologist came by and said, you're in the wrong business. You should be doing something mechanical. And as the story goes, whether it's anecdotal or not, he then became a mechanic for that reason. But a lot of people thought of phrenology in the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s as being a really true science, an interesting, a great way of discovering about your personality. Everybody wanted to know, what am I really like?
As technology progressed, measuring skull bumps by hand became obsolete, and phrenology was automated.
In 1925, a fellow in Superior, Wisconsin, began making a machine to measure the shape of a person's head, and he called it the psychograph. We're going to put this down on your head and print out a paper tape rating your personality 1 through 5, 1 being deficient, 5 being superior. Here we go now.
As ludicrous as all this seems to us now, Gall was closer than he realized. The idea that specific functions are localized in specific areas of the head turned out to be true. But it would take a bizarre accident to prove this, one that sent psychiatry down a particularly nasty track. In 1847, a laborer named Phineas Gage was building a railway line near Vermont. Gage's job was to tamp sticks of dynamite down holes with an iron rod. One day he rammed too hard, causing the dynamite to explode and fire the rod back out the hole and through his head. It entered Gage's cheek and passed out the top of his skull, destroying the left frontal lobe of his brain on the way through. But he amazed everyone by surviving.
He picked himself up, signed out in the book for the day so he'd get paid for the time he was there. And then he went to town, and the doctor who saw him just kind of put a flap back over, put the skin flap back over, put a stitch in it to keep the dirt out. Well, Gage lived for 13 years. His personality changed. He had been a real hard-working, God-fearing family man before the accident, but after the accident, he couldn't hold a job, he got divorced, he'd cuss at the wrong time. It just was a real ne'er-do-well around town.
100 years later, a Portuguese neurologist called Egas Moniz rediscovered Gage's story while researching how to control the most violent of his patients.
And somebody mentioned the fact that Gage's personality changed. He'd gone from a real nice guy to a real jerk. Why couldn't they hopefully reverse that? If you had a real assaultive-aggressive person, either remove portions of the brain or at least disconnect the front from the back and see how that would do.
Moniz developed a method of drilling holes in the skull, inserting a fine instrument, and carefully and strategically severing the connections between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain. This would become known as a frontal lobotomy. His initial results were striking. Severely agitated or violent patients responded almost miraculously to the radical treatment. As a result, Moniz received the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1949. But even after this great reward, he was cautious with his discovery.
He was very reluctant in using this broadly in all kinds of diseases. He was thinking that this operation would be a last-ditch effort to curb very severe disease. It did work only in certain cases. But the followers of Egas Moniz were not so selective.
An ambitious American physician named Walter Freeman read of his success. Unlike Moniz, however, he saw lobotomy as a cure for almost any mental illness and a way of clearing out the country's asylums, packed with the psychological casualties of World War II. Freeman and his partner, James Watts, found Moniz's careful operation too slow for their needs and developed a quick, non-surgical method of their own. Inspired by a common household implement, the transorbital or ice pick lobotomy was born.
The first patient that Freeman and Watts lobotomized was a 63-year-old gal from Kansas, very assaultive, aggressive. The next day they asked her how she felt, and she said, well, she didn't seem to be as excited and it wasn't as important to her. Well, they thought that was just great. But again, the next day she started falling over, her balance was gone, she was throwing up, she lost vision in one eye, just a lot of the side effects they had not expected.
Undeterred, Freeman began performing more and more lobotomies.
The operator lifts the upper eyelid, inserts the leucotome into the conjunctival sac, and aims it parallel with the bony ridge of the nose. He drives the point through the orbital plate, and at a depth of 5 centimeters, swings the handle far laterally. He then returns the instrument to a slightly oblique position, still parallel with the bony ridge of the nose, and drives it 2 centimeters further. Steadying the patient's head, he then moves the handle of the instrument about 20 degrees medially and 30 degrees laterally. In this latter position, he strongly elevates the handle of the instrument, often fracturing the orbital plate, and then finally returns the instrument to the parasagittal plane.
By 1951, Freeman was a celebrity, and nearly 20,000 lobotomies had been performed. By 1955, the number had doubled. Even if his medicine was questionable, his economics weren't. A lobotomy could be performed for $250, while it cost $35,000 or more to keep a patient in hospital for a year. It didn't take much to persuade mental institutions that lobotomy was the answer to all their problems. Luckily for mentally ill people everywhere, a new era was about to dawn. A revolutionary discovery in 1952 would usher in the golden age of drug therapy. By the early 1950s, psychiatric care had reached another dead end. Lobotomy was disgraced, shock therapy only helpful in some cases, and the hospitals were once again crowded with patients with no hope of cure.
For a lot of the patients, it was, yes, it was the last stop. There were patients that were admitted to the hospital that had no hope of leaving the hospital.
But drug researchers were about to come to the rescue. Treating the mentally ill with drugs or chemicals is called psychopharmacology, and the idea is as old as medicine itself. Physicians have recognized the depression-fighting abilities of herbs like St. John's wort for thousands of years, and modern medicine is only just rediscovering much of this knowledge. The earliest recorded blood transfusion was between a cow and a violent mental patient in Paris in 1667. It was hoped the cow's placid nature would transfer over to the patient. Needless to say, neither ended up very happy. In the 19th century, advances in chemistry rekindled interest in using pills and potions to change the personality. The classic tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde showed the transformation happening the wrong way. But physicians hoped it could work for the good of patients and deal mental illness a knockout blow. They would have to wait until 1952 for the first punch to be thrown. A drug designed to fight nausea after anesthesia was found to have amazing effects on acute psychotic illness. Its name was Thorazine.
And this was such a revelation to psychiatry as a whole that you could take these patients who had been hospitalized, some of them for decades, in the back wards of mental hospitals, often under unbelievable conditions, and give them basically a pill that would make them virtually well again.
Hope spread through the besieged doctors and patients in mental hospitals. Its striking results made Thorazine highly profitable. And by the mid-1970s, it had paved the way for a whole generation of new medications.
The discovery of these drugs brought psychiatry back into the mainstream of medicine. It made psychiatric illness seem like all other forms of medical illness, and psychiatrists became once again real doctors instead of glorified social workers. And this happened via the platform of the neurosciences.
One particular area of the brain attracted the close attention of researchers. Although brain cells or neurons transfer signals to each other, they are not actually physically connected. Nerve impulses are transferred across the gap by chemicals called neurotransmitters. One in particular is linked with depression, serotonin. It is believed that imbalances in serotonin levels cause disruption to the brain and negative changes in mood. So when a drug was found that restored the balance of serotonin and seemingly cured depression, researchers knew they were onto a winner. The drug's name was Prozac, and it became one of the largest selling drugs of all time. Introduced in 1987, within 2 years, pharmacies were filling out 65,000 prescriptions per month in the U.S. alone. Within 5 years, 4.5 million Americans had taken it. Soon, it wasn't just the seriously ill who were enjoying the fruits of chemical labor. Antidepressants and tranquilizers quickly became attractive to people who weren't actually sick. They were just unhappy and stressed out. This became known as cosmetic psychopharmacology.
In cases of difficult tension and nervous apprehension, doctors are now prescribing medicine. It makes those who fear they're about to quit feel like they're ready to begin, bidding their darkened spirits goodbye for the calming peace of a cloudless sky. There'll be fewer breakdowns and insomniacs when more of us have learned to be relaxed.
This is perhaps the greatest irony in medical history. We have traveled from the days when treatment was so horrific, the last thing you'd ever want to be is mentally ill, to a time when it is so effective, many of us confess to being ill in order to receive our happiness in an easy-to-swallow form. But just as the number of drugs has increased, so have the number of mental illnesses for them to treat. In the beginning, there was just madness. To that were later added melancholia, mania, and moral defection. In 1930, German psychologist Emil Kraepelin coined the terms schizophrenia and manic depression. And since then, they have been joined by hundreds of other descriptions of our deepest fears and problems. They are cataloged in one huge volume, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, a controversial book now in its 4th edition. Disorders are included or removed by a vote at annual conventions of psychiatrists, a system that some label as political and unscientific. At least one controversy has gone away. Psychosurgery has progressed far beyond the horror days of lobotomy. Doctors can now locate tiny tumors and lesions in the brain using advanced scanning techniques and destroy them without opening the skull or even touching a hair on the patient's head. Radiosurgery uses a so-called gamma knife to project a thin, powerful beam of radiation into a single focus within the brain with pinpoint accuracy. But even with all this technology available, some people still prefer the old-fashioned ways.
I had read in medieval times they did a lot of trepanations to release evil spirits, that they would put a hole in the head that would release the evil spirits. Basically, these people had epilepsy or manic depressives or schizophrenics or so forth. And I thought there must be something more to this. And I suffer from depression, and not nearly as severe as it was before I was trepaned. But I suffered from depression. I thought, what do I have to lose here? I'm 56 years old. I've gone through this depression for years and years and years, and what do I have to lose? Let's try this and see what works. They gave you a mild sedative before the surgery, which put me to sleep because I really wanted to stay awake. I wanted to hear that drill. And after the surgery, you went to recovery for about an hour and a half, and that was it. You get up, you walk out, and you do your thing for the rest of the day. We went shopping.
Safe in Geel, Fernanda is lucky to live in an enlightened and tolerant society whose lessons are just starting to be learnt by the rest of us.
For many years, particularly during the medieval period, the mentally ill were treated more like animals than human beings. And I think one of the greatest changes that I have seen during my career with the Department of Mental Health was the change in attitude toward the patients, realizing again they are human beings and they need to be treated with respect and dignity.
People like Geel District Nurse Mark Hendricks have known this for a long time, and with his help, Fernanda will continue to prosper.
When I talk to Fernanda and ask her what's the difference between an institution and being in family care, she always said, I can go where I want. She feels she's someone. I am a person, I'm doing very well. I can't live on my own because I have some troubles, but I'm free.